They want everyone who chooses to wear a red hat to hate everyone who votes blue. If you're on the blue team, you have to hate everything the red team does. Both sides talk about bullshit issues, while the real issues that impact working class people are never addressed.
So let's talk about these tariffs again. As we know, Trump did Liberation Day and then walked it back. And so, now we're kind of in limbo. The markets tumbled and then they recouped some of those losses and then they tumbled again. And so we're really in a state of flux. But the UAW in particular has been coming out particularly strongly in favor of the destruction of the free trade system, because the free trade system has been so detrimental to working people in the United States and across the globe. And so, Shawn Fain did a long speech on the UAW's YouTube channel on Thursday, where he really broke down and kind of got into the nitty-gritty of the union's position on tariffs. And he made some really important points that I wanted to go over some here. And he started off with talking about how unions and particularly the UAW approach politics that I think is a really good place to kind of level set. So let's listen to how he opened his talk.
One of the great divide and conquer tricks the ruling class has played on the working class of this country is to see politics like a spectator sport. They want everyone who chooses to wear a red hat to hate everyone who votes blue. If you're on the blue team, you have to hate everything the red team does. Both sides talk about bullshit issues to hype up their fan base, while the real issues that impact working class people are never addressed. In the labor movement, at our best, we have a different way of doing politics. We don't make politics about personalities or parties. We see politics as a negotiation. We don't sit down to negotiate with corporate executives because we like them or because we trust them. We focus on what we need as a working class and what the hell it's going to take to get it. And we do that whether we're sitting across from the friendliest CEO or the meanest Wall Street con artist. Politics are just like contract negotiations. You win what you have the power to fight for.
So I think that is a really, really important place to level set and to remind people that this is how we approach politics too here on the Valley Labor Report. We are not a Democrat radio program. We are not, and certainly not, a Republican radio program. We are a union radio program. And so, that's how we approach politics. We approach politics from a working class, an organized labor perspective. And so we want to take a look at what is going to benefit the working class, generally speaking. And I thought that what he said specifically about how we, as unions, we negotiate with employers. Not because we love them, right? I mean, the UAW, when they go to negotiate with Ford, they don't do that because they love the Ford's, third generation owner Prince guy, right? Like they don't love him, but they negotiate with him. And they praise the company when they do things that are good for the workers, when they agree to things that the UAW is asking for, and they fight them like hell when they are doing things the UAW is not asking for, right? And so I think that's a really good place to level set and just say, this is how we approach politics and how we think that everybody should approach politics. It's not like red team, blue team. It's about the policies, and are the policies good or bad for working people, right? And this is kind of something of a bailiwick of ours. I don't know, Adam, if you had anything else that you wanted to say about that idea.
Yeah, just that, I think that is really how we approach these issues. And you may disagree on our conclusions, right? You may think that we're off base on any particular issue or subject. But, please do know that's absolutely the perspective we take. It's what is working for the working class, what's not working for the working class. And it is specifically around the working class majority, the vast majority of us who do not own capital, but instead work for a living. And, that's not how everyone does politics. A lot of people are very hyper-partisan and do treat it like a team sport. You also have a lot of people who will be very explicit with you that they are about business, right? They look at what's good for businesses. Alabama's politicians are notorious for that. They brag about the fact that they set policies to be good for businesses.
Right.
And we take a different approach. We look at actual people and put people above profits and put the planet above profits and look at what's really good for the working class majority and, evaluate that and recognize that these politicians are folks that we have to pressure, whether it's folks that you like, right? We run into this all the time, especially, in more local and state-based politics where people will say, oh, but, I know their mama and them. I go to church with them. They're good people, but they are doing destructive things day in, day out to you and your community and your family. And so you've got to look beyond personality, beyond party, and look at the substance of what are they actually doing? Who are they actually representing? Are they representing regular folks like us, or are they representing special interest, the types of folks who can, afford to contribute to campaigns, to do super PACs, and all of that kind of thing? So I appreciate President Fain, making that distinction. And again, you may disagree with some of the conclusions that come from that perspective. And that's fine. And we can actually have the same kind of class-based perspective and reach different conclusions. But I do think that's really important because that is not typically what you hear in the media, right? If you tune into the typical talk radio show that's going to be on WVNN, where you may be listening right now, it is not about, they don't approach politics and the news of the day based on what they calculate is best for the working class majority. It is very much not that way. It is in a partisan way or an entertainment-based way. But that's not, that's not helpful for us. And so that's what I encourage all of my members or all of the workers that I engage with is, take those party blinders off and look realistically at what's helping working people, what's hurting working people. Let's look at the real enemies here and, have situational allies as they are appropriate, but, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, typically in politics.
Right. And he does a little bit more level setting, and we're going to go through all, a little bit of each of the things that he tries to level set on. And another one that he does is just a reminder that the UAW has always opposed. It's not a new thing for the UAW to be opposing free trade. And so let's listen to this.
One thing we've always fought for under Democrats or Republicans is an end to the free trade disaster. We've seen some reckless and chaotic activity on trade from this administration, and there's a lot of fear of disruption. But what we have to remember is that disruption's not new to factory workers in this country. Disruption is what we've been living with for 30 years under a free trade disaster. It doesn't mean we support reckless random tariffs. I don't believe that's the answer to all this. But there is a reason for tariffs. And it's also a mistake to just defend the status quo, especially when it comes to free trade.
And that's so important. And I think, as much criticism as Shawn Fain has gotten, I really do think that the UAW is threading the needle well here. And it is a needle that needs to be thread, because right now, and Hakeem Jeffries has come out and been publicly critical of the UAW and is saying that doing this threading of the needle is detrimental to the Democrats' messaging that tariffs are bad. And Hakeem Jeffries has said, well, look, when we're in good faith, And also, Hakeem Jeffries is the vehicle for this thing, but I think that this position could be held by a person in good faith, and so, I'll present it that way. But, Hakeem Jeffries has said that by threading this needle and saying Trump tariffs bad, but some tariffs good, and so we need to kind of walk this line here, you are making it more difficult for people to kind of understand the message that the Trump tariffs are bad and that this is not going to be something that helps working people. And I for one, it's not the union's job to message for the Democrats, so I'm sorry, Hakeem Jeffries and my good faith friends, that's not our job. That's your job. Our job is to represent our members and the working class. And like Shawn Fain said, the working class has continued to face disruption during the free trade disaster. And that is something that is common, particularly to people in the automotive manufacturing industry. And something that something on the flip side that he has said, that Shawn Fain has said, these tariffs need to be paired with other things like industrial policy, like investment. There was a good historical anecdote from Sam Gindin, who was a senior advisor for then the Canadian Auto Workers Union and now for Unifor. About how in the 80s, Ronald Reagan put quotas on Japanese car manufacturers, and that did not actually increase working standards for American auto workers. What happened was Japanese automotive manufacturers came to the South and exploited Southern workers. And so much like the argument for free trade has been, maybe some American auto workers are going to be hurt, but Mexican auto workers are going to be lifted up, and American consumers are going to be benefited. Well, obviously, union auto workers in America have been hurt. Mexican auto workers have been hurt. Their real wages have been cut by 50% since the introduction of NAFTA. When NAFTA was introduced, a Mexican auto worker made on average $6 an hour. Now they make $3 an hour. Okay, cut in by 50%. But also, auto workers in Alabama have had their working conditions cut. When Mercedes first came to Alabama in the 90s, which was also kind of coincidentally when NAFTA was introduced, the average Alabama auto worker made 20% more than they do today. They have faced a 20% pay cut, right? So this free trade thing has not been beneficial to working people. And so one of the things that people have been criticizing Shawn Fain on, and we're not going to spend very much time on this because it is silly, and I think Shawn Fain speaks for himself well here, is that, Shawn Fain is trying to cozy up to the Trump administration. Shawn Fain is trying to, mollycoddle Trump and play nice with him. And I just don't think that you can actually see what the UAW has done and come to that conclusion. I don't think you can, because here, I'm going to play this clip for you. Shawn Fain is going to list off a litany of criticisms that he and his union have made very publicly against the Trump administration. And in this context, when we have this big video about tariffs and free trade and everything, they are said as an aside, but each of these have been their own big thing for the UAW. The UAW has issued, single statements about each of these issues. The UAW has participated in rallies specifically for each of these issues, right? And so these are not, they're said as an aside in this long conversation about free trade, but they are not a side issue for the UAW, and the UAW is taking them very seriously. And so here are some, just a few of the things that the UAW has criticized the Trump administration on.
So far, here's what we've seen from the Trump administration. We've seen the destruction of bargaining rights for 1 million federal workers. That's not good for the working class. We've seen attacks on the National Labor Relations Board, including illegally firing a board member, leading to deadlock on workers' cases. That's not good for the working class. We've seen attacks planned on Social Security, on Medicare, on Medicaid, programs that millions of workers depend on. That's not good for the working class. We've seen the absolute trampling of constitutional rights. We have seen the First Amendment go up in smoke at college campuses with detentions, deportations, expulsions, and firings of people who dared to speak out against and protest against a war, just to call for a ceasefire. We have seen the right to due process disappear as working people are deported for no crime and no reason. That's not good for the working class. Mahmoud Khalil, who has now been detained for over a month for protesting the war, is a former UAW member. Grant Minor, the UAW president of Local 2710 at Columbia University, was expelled for protesting a war the day before the bargaining was going to start. Ramisa Ozturk, an SEIU member at Tufts University, has been detained for writing an op-ed. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a sheet metal apprentice in Maryland, was deported for no reason, no crime, to a prison in El Salvador. We've seen the arbitrary and unlawful termination of hundreds of our members' visas, which may lead to their unjust deportation. And the list goes on. And there is a reason we campaigned aggressively against this vision of America in the last election. We will continue to speak out against it and mobilize against it. This week, our union participated in mass protests around the country as part of our campaign to kill the cuts at the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. The NIH is a part of the federal government that funds essential scientific research. That's not waste, it's not fraud, it's not abuse. We represent 5,000 members who just won their first union contract at the National Institute of Health. We also represent tens of thousands of members whose jobs rely on funding provided by NIH at universities across the country. When we cure cancer, when we save lives with new medications, it's because of these workers who bust their asses on high-level research that changes the world. Our government should expand funding for life-saving research and allow researchers in the U.S. to be the first to find cures for diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's. Cutting research funding kills union jobs, and even worse, it kills the hope of working people who rely on this research to see new treatments to save the loved ones' lives.
Okay, so there you go. And we're going to talk some more about some of those issues later on in the program, but it is very, very clear Shawn Fain is not doing, frankly, what Sean O'Brien is doing, right? I mean, Sean O'Brien promised he was going to call balls and strikes, and it's going to be very, he's going to, I mean, Sean O'Brien promised that he was going to do what Shawn Fain is going to do, what Shawn Fain is doing. And I do not see what they're doing as comparable, frankly. So there you go. I had another clip where, he was responding to some allegations of flip-flopping, but, I think that we basically made the point there. And so let's dig into some more about the tariffs. Here is where he lays out the UAW's position on tariffs.
Here is our position as a union on tariffs and free trade. Number one, free trade has been a disaster for the working class, and we have to end these broken anti-worker policies. Number two, we can and should reshore tens of thousands of jobs in very short order, which would raise the standard for all workers. Strategic tariffs can play a role in that. Number three, the automakers, the auto market, and corporate America can't afford it. So let's get into the details on these tariffs. Right now, there are three main kinds of tariffs on the table. Some of these tariffs target entire countries. Some of these tariffs target specific industries. Big picture, we support some use of tariffs on auto manufacturing and other similar industries. We don't support the use of tariffs for political games about immigration or fentanyl. We do not support reckless, chaotic tariffs on all countries at crazy rates. We absolutely support and have always supported tariffs on the auto industry, on heavy truck, and on agricultural implements. The difference is the auto tariffs are designed for a specific purpose. They raise the cost on the companies that have killed good jobs in a race to the bottom for cheap labor elsewhere, while Wall Street makes a killing. Specifically, We have industries where right now there are active plants operating under capacity in the U.S. while workers outside the U.S. are exploited for $3 an hour.
And so he goes into that, and I was fascinated by how many jobs could be created really like that, like at the snap of your fingers. How much capacity within only the union automotive manufacturers is being underutilized. Let's take a look at what Shawn Fain says here.
We took a look at just a handful of Big Three plants. We wanted to look just at the recent past. We asked ourselves, how many more vehicles could we produce if we went back to the levels that those plants operated at just 10 years ago? And the answer is staggering. 10 years ago, 12 Big Three plants that are still in operation right now were producing over 2 million more vehicles every year. 2 million more vehicles per year. These plants still have that capacity right now. That's tens of thousands of jobs that we could bring back right now. Our research tells us that if the Big Three alone just got their currently active plants up to 100% capacity, they could add 50,000 jobs. Let me say that again. If they just used the plants that were already running and hired up to full capacity, we could add over 50,000 jobs at the Big Three alone. That's not even including closed plants like Lordstown Assembly in Ohio, which could bring thousands more jobs back. That's not including building new plants. And don't forget, for every 100 auto assembly jobs that are created in the United States, there are another 700 jobs created in the supply chain. 50,000 more jobs in the Big Three means hundreds of thousands of more jobs at parts suppliers and other businesses that support it. That's not even including non-union automakers. That's if we just stop letting the automakers get away with murder by running a race to the bottom under our broken trade deals.
That is astounding. You could see 50,000 new jobs if only the active Big Three automotive manufacturing plants went up to 100% capacity. That is huge. And again, like you said, that doesn't count for 40,000 new jobs that could be created at non-union facilities. That doesn't account for parts suppliers. That doesn't account opening closed plants like Lordstown. That doesn't count IPS and suppliers and stuff like that. And so lots of new jobs can be created at the drop of a hat if they, if they do it. If they just move some production back to the United States, where it was less than 10 years ago, right? And so you hear a lot about, they can't immediately respond. They can't immediately ramp up production. It takes years to build new factories. And it's like, well, actually, for a lot of it, you don't have to build new factories. You can just use what you have here. So that's really important for folks to recognize. Here are some other things that the UAW wants to see in a new trade deal.
I want to be clear about this. The Trump administration is the first administration in my lifetime that's been willing to do something about this broken free trade system. Tariffs are the first step. But we need to put out our vision for an auto industry that doesn't leave behind working class people. And then we need to fight like hell for it. In 2026, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA, which is the new rendition of NAFTA, is up for review. And in the last presidential election, the candidates from both the Democrat and Republican parties agreed we need to rewrite that deal. The fact is, under the USMCA, auto workers are still living under a race to the bottom. Mexican auto workers are still having their union rights trampled on. American auto workers are still under constant threat of plant closures. We want to sit down at the bargaining table and renegotiate the USMCA trade deal today. A new trade deal for North America should have a manufacturing minimum wage. Workers on two sides of a border should not have to compete with one another in a race to the bottom. A new trade deal for North America should make it so if you want to sell product in a country, you have to make a product in a country. That would be good for Canada, for the US, and for Mexico. A new trade deal should fix the race to the bottom in the supply chain also. We don't want our IPS members, who are just as essential to this industry, to be left behind. We need enforcement mechanisms to make sure that trade is tied to how these companies treat their workers. And we need a trade agreement that guarantees that labor rights are protected in Canada, the US, and Mexico. So that's what we're fighting for. And already, dozens of members of Congress have called for renegotiating the USMCA. That's the first step.
And so I think, again, I'll reiterate that I think, and people disagree with me, but I think that Shawn Fain is doing a really good job of threading this needle, of recognizing and pointing out that defending the status quo is not acceptable and is not going to be enough. And you do have to thread this needle. You do have to remind people that you as a leader recognize free trade has been a disaster. Trump is doing something to try to change it, and it is not enough, right? That's what you need to say, that it's not enough. And it's not going to, it's not going to, what he's doing, solve all of these problems. But you can't just be opposed to it, because then you are perceived as defending the status quo, which is how we got here. And so I'll wrap up here where Shawn Fain wrapped up, talking about how the free trade has the free trade disaster has resulted in what we're seeing right now. Let's listen to this.
No matter what party you voted for, understand this. There is a direct line between the free trade disaster and the political chaos in this country. Plant closures and mass layoffs resulted in intense pain and suffering and anger for hundreds of thousands of working families in our country. All that pain and anger had to go somewhere. A lot of it went to support Donald Trump for president. And now it's being directed at immigrants, at transgender people, at higher education. And that's the wrong target. The right target is corporate America. And the sooner both parties understand this, the sooner our country will begin to deal with our real issues. We need to build a political movement that can put the working class first. And to do that, we're going to need working class people to step up, to speak up, and take on corporate America, from the bargaining table to the ballot box. No matter who's on the other side of that table or in that office, we're going to have to stand up and stand strong with integrity on our issues.
So there you go. I think that Shawn Fain, again, did a really good job threading this needle. And I think it's important to thread the needle. I don't think that you can just say tariffs bad, because working people have had their lives destroyed by the free trade disaster. And we need to recognize that even if it's true, and it is, that Donald Trump's solution is not going to fix everything, we cannot just defend the status quo. Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate. Appreciate all the comments in the chat from the last segment. Quirky Geek Girl says, building more cars is not going to solve the larger environmental problem, that for a greener future, you need to invest in more public transit, high-speed rail, etc. That's absolutely true, and it's a good point. I do think it's a separate point, right, than the tariffs and the free trade and everything.
Well, I mean, I guess in the sense that we need those things to be built, and ideally they're built here at home, right? With good union jobs, local, right? Because I want Canadian transit built by Canadian workers. I want American transit built by American workers. It makes sense to, keep the wealth flowing closer to home. But
and it shouldn't just be new cars that are built, but unfortunately, America has been built around the car, and it would take,
especially here in the South,
especially really anywhere, west of anywhere like west of Washington D.C. or west of Boston and south of North Carolina. I mean, it's terrible. We've done just a horrible thing by building our country around the car. And so that's just a whole other thing. But we, and like building more trains isn't, the train cars isn't going to be the thing that actually brings more public transit. It's going to take, real change at the local, state, and national level to really do public transit. But she made the point later in the chat, the younger generation wants transit instead of cars, and I count myself among that. I mean, I love, like, there was one time that I spent like a week or two in DC, and the whole the idea about cars, like the propaganda around cars, is that, oh, it's so freeing, right? You get so much freedom from the car. I have never felt like less constricted than I did, as far as like I can go wherever I want, than I did when I was in DC, and I could jump on the subway and be anywhere that I wanted in 30 minutes without having to drive, without having to find a place to park, without having to take my car, without having to, like I literally walk out of the hotel and then decide where I want to be in the next 30 minutes, and then I'm there. It's like, it's so nice, and being able to walk is nice. It's good for you, and I liked it. So yeah,
right. And I'm not a bicycle guy, but I really appreciate those who bring up that point, being able to bike in terms of their commute and having bike-friendly cities and communities. So yeah, that's a whole really interesting conversation, and there's a whole element to it in terms of the workforce participation and the economic growth that comes from having solid public transportation, right? Because it makes it easier for people to get to work, to go to doctor's appointments, to go to school. It makes it easier for folks to participate in the economy in all of those different ways, right? Because, you think about, especially here in Alabama or in many states like ours, where in so many communities, if something goes wrong with your car, your life is on hold.
Right.
Your life is on hold. You cannot get to work, and therefore, okay, well, now how are you going to pay to fix the car when I've got to go to work to make the money to fix the car? It can be a real barrier, and so that's something that weighs on me a lot, especially in rural communities where and you have. I was just talking to a union brother last night about some of these issues, and we talked about how there's a lot of folks out there that are driving these, cars that are worth less than $5,000, right? And they're having to pay for the tag and title and registration, pay for the liability insurance. And by the time they do all that, it's worth, they're spending more than the car's really worth, but that's the only way they can get around. And, it just really, it is something that we have to be more intentional about, especially given the climate catastrophe we're in. We have to expand public transportation in a big way, but that is also to kind of tie it back to this discussion. It is an opportunity to have domestically grown, really solid, good union jobs. We need that infrastructure. We need that equipment. We need all of the work that goes into that. So I know people like to make fun of the Green New Deal and joke about that. But, if you look at the opportunity that we have, there's a huge need, and that is a huge opportunity. And we could put people to work all over this country, including in depressed, historically marginalized communities that don't have many jobs, like some of these rural areas where there's just not a lot of options. Let's put folks to work building out a robust 21st century public transit system.
Yeah. Let's take a look at some more comments. We got a lot Appreciate y'all for participating in the chat. Brandon Hill says, God damn, I would vote for that man. I would vote for Shawn Fain too, for sure. He's great. And he said, further, thank you guys for playing that. I didn't understand why the UAW was taking the position it did on the tariffs, and I hadn't had the chance to watch Fain's talk. A nuanced take helped me understand. And yeah, I think that I do think that a genuinely good faith person can come to a different strategic position than Shawn Fain did, but I think that where Shawn Fain is at is coming from a place of good faith, and he's doing a good job of like I said, threading the needle. So hopefully that was helpful for some folks. Quirky Geek Girl says the map of high-speed trains in China compared to 15 years ago is amazing. Yeah, it is. It really is. China's doing a lot. They're doing a lot of good stuff, I think.
Well, be careful saying that.
Yeah, it could get me deported. Crazy. Let's see. I enjoy driving, but I loathe finding parking. I actually, Dr. Mad said that. I like neither, but I particularly hate finding parking, and it's just so frustrating.
Yeah, especially in densely populated areas like downtowns, and where there's just not a lot of parking, and then it's such a ripoff too. I took my family to Chattanooga recently, and just finding parking, and then you spend $20 for an hour or some ridiculous rate. I know they do that at concerts. That's a big one too.
The urbanists would say that actually it's still probably in most cities too cheap, because the goal of parking prices in the urbanist way of thinking, I'm not totally sure what's right, but in their way of thinking, it's not actually to generate revenue. You don't actually want to generate. It's to dissuade people from using parking and to get them using public transit instead.
Right.
And that allows you, and by dissuading people, you can take some of the parking and make it even more, scarce of a product, and further push more people into public transit. That would be their argument.
Yeah, I understand it.
Brandon says, I'm working with Teamsters and want to be a dues-paying member, but man, I wish O'Brien was way more like Fain. I feel like O'Brien is playing politics and Fain is actually representing the workers. Yeah, I agree. Quirky Geek Girl says, whenever I bike or take transit somewhere to meet someone with a car, I always get there first because I don't have to deal with traffic or find parking. Yep, that's true. Austin Fan for Life. Jacob, Article 1 only sets a maximum amount of funds by Congress. It does not set a minimum. Nothing in Article 1 or Article 2 says the executive has to spend the maximum amount of funds. Well, that's not what we were talking about. The reason that I referenced Article 1 was that Congress gets to decide what is spent and how it is spent, and I was referencing that specifically with respect to protections for workers that Congress set. So those being the reduction in force procedures, those being protections against firing for board officials at the National Labor Relations Board and the Merit Systems Protections Board. And in the National Labor Relations Act, it specifically says that board members cannot be fired but for negligence and stuff, right? So Congress expected a situation where board members would be overlapping with presidents of the opposing party, and they set that, and the Supreme Court 100 years ago in Humphrey's Executor said that is okay, and in lots of Supreme Court cases since then, they have reaffirmed that basic decision. And so I'm not even talking here because, this Austin Fan for Life must be a big Trump guy. And he must have heard me disagree with Trump, and then he just heard me disagree with Trump, and then he said, oh, I'm thinking of something else, and now I'm going to respond to the something else that was not said. I'm not even responding to the argument about grants or programs or anything like that. I'm saying Congress has set protections for the civil service that should be respected. Congress has set protections for board members of independent agencies that should be respected because of Article 1. But Austin Fan for Life, didn't hear that. He heard me criticizing Daddy Trump and said something else. Dr. Mad said, the tough thing is that O'Brien was the compromise candidate for the Teamsters Reform Caucus, so you get what you get. That's true. A lot of people don't realize this either, but Sean O'Brien is not a TDU guy. Teamsters for a Democratic Union, the Reform Caucus within the Teamsters. Sean O'Brien was actually a fierce opponent of the TDU for a long time before he publicly broke with the Hoffa regime. And so Sean O'Brien, not a TDU guy, was very antagonistic towards them for a very long time. Palace says, I would love to live in the middle of nowhere, but it is a hell of a convenience to have so many things close by in case things go wrong. Yeah, indeed. I have lived both, like 45 minutes from civilization, like way out in the country, and right in the middle of downtown, and living in the middle of downtown I like it way better. Let's see.
Yeah, I like a lot about, the rural lifestyle. I do like, the just being out in the country and having some of that space and freedom. But man, is it an inconvenience.
Yeah, huge inconvenience.
Every time there's just, you need something, right? Groceries, medicine, you name it. It is just a major inconvenience, and it's a real tough thing. And, something that I think a lot of workers are dealing with are these long commutes. It's not something we talk about a whole lot, but it kind of connects to both the rural living and as well as the transit conversation, because so many people are commuting 30, 45, 60 minutes or more. There are people who, work in the Huntsville area that are coming from over an hour away. And that's pretty common. A lot of the folks who live in some of the surrounding counties around Madison County here in the Tennessee Valley, they're making that long commute. And, you think about an hour and a half, 2 hours of your day every day, that's just gone. Yeah. And you're having to pollute the environment. You're having to spend your own hard-earned money to do that. And so that's something else that I think is a factor when you start looking at these issues, because, in a lot of communities, there's just not a lot of jobs to go to. There's just not a lot of options. And so, maybe you're in a type of career where remote work is a possibility, though that's, clearly under attack in many industries, particularly in the public sector. But, maybe you have that opportunity. But if not, it can be really tough to find a decent job that's close by and where you can actually, have a decent lifestyle. It's a really tough barrier that a lot of folks, in the South in particular are dealing with.
Right. Doodle Cupcake says, how much of a lack of public transit is also a function of a fascist/authoritarian society? The less people can get around, the more isolated and alone they are. And that's interesting that you brought that up, because that's actually been, I don't know how much of like a purposeful thing that is, but I do think that there's like a correlation there that I've read about in like analysis of union campaigns and stuff, and particularly, attempts to organize non-union automakers in the South, because that is such a common experience for auto workers in the South, driving, 50 minutes, 45, 30 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours to get to your job. And so they're not really being like places of, like public places like people just walk to from the job. And so that's actually been something that the UAW has identified as something that makes it more difficult to organize in the South, is how dispersed everybody is, and how there's not like a central location, and how that does make it easy to be atomized.
Right, absolutely. I mean, and just on a practical level, the hour that they spend in the car is an hour that they're not around their coworkers at the neighborhood pub or restaurant or at church or wherever. And so, yeah, I think that absolutely is a barrier that a lot of folks are dealing with. The geographic disbursement, the long commute times, the relative isolation of folks. We've talked about that before on the show, and how really in a lot of ways, labor organizing in today's environment, you're having to build a lot of belonging and just relationship connections, and just get people talking to each other and spending time with each other. I mean, that's a big hurdle.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.